The wind carried dust like whispers of forgotten stories, each grain of sand shimmering in the last light of day, as though the earth itself wished to speak. Eleanor Hayes tightened her grip on the worn handle of her carpet-bag, her eyes fixed on the road that wound endlessly westward. Behind her stretched miles of emptiness. Ahead lay only uncertainty. Yet her heart pressed forward, aching with longing, a fragile flame of hope refusing to die. She had left Ohio believing in letters that promised fertile land, a husband's embrace, and a life reborn. What she found instead was silence, an abandoned homestead, and a loneliness that threatened to hollow her out from within. Still, fate had a curious way of weaving threads where none seemed to exist. Her boots crunched on the dry earth as she walked toward the town square, drawn by murmurs that rippled through the air like a rising tide. The crowd gathered. They did not laugh, did not sing. Their eyes were riveted to the iron monument in the center, a cage tall as two men, blackened by sun and dust, its bars thick as chains of destiny itself. Inside, motionless as a carved figure, sat a man. His dark hair fell ragged across his face, his body draped in torn clothes, his wrists shackled as though he were a beast pulled from the mountain to be displayed before the curious and the cruel. Eleanor paused, heart caught between fear and fascination. She had known many kinds of men, her father's harsh fists, her late husband's fleeting kindness, turned to bitterness by the world's injustice. But this one, this silent figure, emanated something different. Not savagery, not madness, but sorrow, so deep it seemed to hum in the air around him. It called to her in ways she could not explain, like the low note of a hymn reverberating through an empty church. She could not look away. A woman beside her whispered, "That's the mountain man. Killed Tom Garrett, they say. Maybe more. Sheriff keeps him locked until the judge rides through. They say he's dangerous. Cursed." Dangerous. Cursed. Words townspeople used to justify their fear, the same fear that had stolen Eleanor's first husband in a land dispute and left her a widow before 27. Fear was a mask for cruelty. She had learned that truth early, and as she studied the man in the cage, she recognized not the glint of cruelty, but the broken light of grief. His stillness was too deliberate, his silence too heavy. He was not a beast. He was a man who had lost something too great to name. Her throat tightened. She remembered sleepless nights in Ohio when grief hollowed her chest so completely that words refused to come. She had wandered like a ghost through her days until the letters from Samuel Morrison arrived, offering escape, offering belonging. But Morrison was gone, his promises smoke in the wind, and here she stood before another man abandoned by mercy. Perhaps it was madness that made her linger, but sometimes madness is simply the courage to see what others will not. The sheriff barked at the crowd to disperse, but Eleanor did not move. Instead, she stepped closer, the air hotter near the iron bars. She could almost feel his breath in the stillness. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the weight of something larger than herself. No answer, no flicker of acknowledgement. Yet when the sun shifted, she caught a glimpse beneath the curtain of hair, eyes grey as storm clouds, watching, waiting, wounded. She drew in a breath as though the air itself had turned sacred. Those eyes held oceans of pain, yet also a quiet dignity that seemed to plead without words. "See me. Do not believe what they say. Remember that I was once a man." In that moment, Eleanor's heart leapt in defiance of the dust, the whispers, the entire weight of Foulridge's judgment. She had been silenced before by grief, crushed beneath injustice, and she knew with every aching bone, that she could not walk away. She had promised herself never again to be a woman who watched cruelty in silence. And so, as the last glow of daylight fell across her hands, she reached into her bag and felt the cool curve of her wedding ring, the final remnant of her old life. Her fingers closed around it as though it were a key. If redemption exists in this world, let it begin here. The hush of the crowd deepened as Eleanor lifted her chin. She did not raise her voice in anger. She spoke with calmness, carved from years of endurance. "If you call this justice," she said to the sheriff, to the town, to the sky above, "then let me remind you that mercy is its twin. If none among you will stand for him, then I will. I offer him my hand, my name, my vow." Gasps rippled like wind across dry grass. Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. A widow marrying a beast? She must be mad. But Eleanor's gaze did not falter, fixed on the man within the cage. Slowly, so faintly it could have been mistaken for the shift of shadow, he lifted his head. Their eyes locked again, grey storm to steadfast flame, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not romance yet, nor love, nor even trust. It was recognition. Two broken souls acknowledging the mirror of each other's pain. The sheriff sputtered, "You don't even know his name." "Then I will give him one," Eleanor answered softly, her voice carrying like a prayer over the dust. She pressed the ring against the bars, the gold catching what little light remained. "And with it, I give him a chance at life." The storm-grey eyes did not blink. Then, as though the world itself had held its breath, the man gave a single deliberate nod. Eleanor exhaled, and in that fragile moment between dusk and night, a new story began. The dust rose, the townspeople jeered, the sheriff cursed, but Eleanor no longer heard them. Her heart had chosen, reckless though it was. In this unlikely vow lay not only the stranger's hope, but her own. Hope of healing, of beginning again, of building something sacred from the ruins. She stepped back from the cage, the ring warm against her palm, and knew there would be no turning away. Beyond the square, the wilderness stretched wide and merciless, but it also held freedom, and perhaps, just perhaps, a home neither of them had dared to imagine. If this moment stirs something within you, if it reminds you that even in the harshest deserts, seeds of love and mercy can take root, I invite you to hold that warmth close. And if you wish to walk further with this story, to see where Eleanor's courage and the silent stranger's sorrow might lead, I would be grateful for your gentle support. A like, a comment, a subscription. Small gestures, yet they are like kindling to a fire, keeping this journey alive and shared. The crowd's noise dimmed behind her as Eleanor stood tall, her eyes still fixed on the man in chains. His silence was no longer emptiness, it was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. And as the night descended over Foulridge, she felt the first stirrings of a destiny neither cage nor cruelty could contain. The road ahead was uncertain, shadowed by danger and mistrust. Yet the first step had been taken, and with that step Eleanor and the silent man moved toward the wilderness, where healing waited like dawn beyond the longest night. The night gathered around them like a heavy quilt, stitched with silence and the faint cries of coyotes drifting across the barren land. Eleanor walked with her carpet bag held close, every step carrying her farther from the town that had condemned him and closer to the unmarked road where both their fates would entwine. Behind her came the soft, uneven rhythm of shackled feet, the clink of chains, a haunting echo in the darkness. Yet there was no menace in that sound, only weariness and the fragile weight of freedom newly granted. The sheriff and his men had watched until the last lights of Fow Ridge faded behind them, muttering threats of pursuit should they ever return. Eleanor had not looked back. She knew too well the cruelty of places that lived off rumor and fear. Forward was the only direction left, and forward meant this silent man, her husband now by law and vow, following with careful distance, as though afraid his very presence might shatter the courage she had displayed. The moon rose pale above the ridges, casting a silver glow upon the road. Eleanor's breath softened as she listened to the night, her pulse beginning to steady. When she glanced behind her, she found his eyes upon her, storm-grey and unreadable, yet watching with a quiet intensity. There was something protective in the way he walked, always a few paces back, but alert to every sound, every shadow. It was as though, even in his brokenness, some instinct compelled him to shield rather than harm. They walked until the stars multiplied, blazing like a million lanterns above. The road wound into open scrubland, where juniper trees offered sparse shelter. Eleanor's feet ached within her boots, the straps of her bag cutting into her palms. At last, she paused near a cluster of rocks, setting her burden down with a sigh. "We'll rest here," she murmured, though she knew he would not answer. He stopped a little way off, standing in silence as though unsure of permission. She nodded toward the clearing. "Sit!" The single word felt strange on her tongue, commanding yet gentle, as one might coax a wounded creature nearer. Slowly, with that same careful grace, he lowered himself to the ground, his chains rattling softly. Eleanor knelt to gather fallen branches, her hands trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. Before she could strike a match, he moved, quiet as shadow, collecting wood with efficient motions despite the weight of iron on his wrists. He arranged the branches with deliberate care, forming a pyramid that spoke of long practice. Then, with sparks coaxed from stone and skill born of solitude, he conjured flame into being. The fire leapt alive, warming the circle between them, casting his features into light for the first time. Eleanor studied him openly. His beard was rough, his cheeks hollowed by hunger, yet beneath the grime lay a strength not entirely diminished. His scars were many, along his hands, his arms, his throat, but they told not of savagery, but of survival. From her bag she produced dried bread, a strip of beef, and a small tin cup of water. She placed these between them, an offering. He hesitated, then reached carefully, as if afraid she might withdraw. When he bit into the food, his movements were slow, reverent, like a man remembering how to live. She shared her portion, forcing herself to eat, though her stomach twisted with weariness. In the quiet crackle of fire, a fragile rhythm emerged, the first of many they would forge together. When the meal was done, she drew out a needle and thread, setting about mending the torn fabric of her dress. The silence pressed heavy, so she spoke into it, not with questions he could not answer, but with fragments of her own truth. She told him of Ohio, of James and the land dispute, of betrayal and loss. The words poured like water from a vessel cracked too long, spilling into the night air. He listened, his eyes fixed upon her, his stillness no longer empty but attentive. When her voice faltered, he surprised her. He reached for a stick, drawing shapes into the dirt near the fire, a horseshoe carved simple yet precise. Then he mimed hammering, the rise and fall of a blacksmith's arm. Eleanor's breath caught. "You worked with metal," she whispered. He inclined his head, just enough to confirm. The firelight shimmered against his profile, and for the first time she saw a glimpse of who he had been. Hands skilled, life purposeful, heart once bound to creation instead of chains. Her throat tightened with unexpected warmth. "Then, you are not what they said." He looked at her then, eyes storm-grey yet softened, as though her words reached somewhere long buried. His lips parted, but no sound came. Still he lifted his shackled hands and pressed them together, a gesture of acknowledgement, of promise, of something tender struggling through the cracks. The desert grew colder as night deepened. Eleanor spread her single blanket near the fire. She looked at him, at the way he sat rigid, knees drawn up as though to guard himself against both chill and kindness. "There is room," she said softly. "It may not be proper, but propriety has no place out here. Warmth does." He shook his head, stubborn, pointing to the ground beside him. She frowned, then laid the blanket wide, extending her hand. "Please." For a moment he did not move. Then slowly, as if stepping across an unseen threshold, he joined her. He lay on the farthest edge, his back turned, body tense as a drawn bow. She settled beside him, leaving respectful space, yet close enough that the blanket could cover them both. The chains clinked with each careful adjustment. Eleanor reached out without thinking, resting her fingers lightly upon his shoulder. He flinched, every muscle jolting. She withdrew at once. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's only... those irons must hurt." He did not speak, but gradually his breathing eased. He did not pull farther away. That was enough. They lay together in silence, the fire crackling low, the stars wheeling overhead. And though they were strangers bound by law and desperation, something unseen settled between them, an unspoken vow that this night they would not face the darkness alone. Eleanor closed her eyes, the ache of miles fading beneath the warmth of the fire and the presence beside her. She thought of the cage, of the grey eyes lifting to meet hers, of the nod that had sealed their fate. Perhaps the world called her mad, but as sleep drifted near, she felt a strange peace, fragile yet healing, as though mercy itself had wrapped around her heart. When dawn brushed the horizon with strokes of rose and gold, she woke to find the blanket tucked carefully around her shoulders, and her companion crouched near the embers, grinding stone against iron. The shackles scraped with each motion, his wrists raw where metal had bitten. Eleanor sat up quickly. "Let me tend that." He paused, hesitant, then held out his hands. She cleaned the abraded skin, applied the last of her salve, her touch gentle as balm. He watched her, expression unreadable, yet softened by trust. When she finished, he returned to his task with renewed strength, filing patiently at the locks. Sparks flew, and at last, with a click like thunder, the first cuff sprang open. He stared at his freed hand as though it belonged to someone else. Then, with steady resolve, he set to work on the second. The final shackle fell into the dust, and he rose, chains clutched in one fist. With sudden violence, he hurled them against the rocks until the iron bent and broke, twisted beyond use. The sound echoed across the wilderness like a declaration. He stood panting, chest heaving, eyes burning not with rage but with release. Eleanor felt tears blur her vision. "Better?" she whispered. He nodded once, then, astonishingly, took her hand in both of his, holding it briefly with a gratitude words could never contain. Then he let go, stepping back, the moment already transforming into the steady rhythm of survival. They packed what little they had and walked on together, no longer prisoner and savior, but something more fragile, more profound. The sun climbed, the road stretched, and the wilderness opened before them like a page yet unwritten. Eleanor glanced at him, at the storm-grey eyes softened by dawn. She did not know his past, nor if the world would ever forgive him. But she knew this. She had chosen mercy, and in that choice lay the first trembling seeds of love. The path ahead twisted toward the valley Samuel Morrison had promised in letters, though she no longer clung to his ghost. She clutched instead at the living presence beside her, silent yet steady, wounded yet strong. And as they walked, she felt the faint hum of possibility rising, warm as sunlight after endless cold, guiding them toward the next chapter waiting just beyond the horizon. The road led them deeper into the wild, where the harsh plains softened into foothills, brushed with pine, and the sound of a creek wound like a lullaby through the air. Eleanor paused at the crest of a slope, her breath catching at the sight that spread beneath them. A valley lay open, cradled by mountains that rose like sentinels, their peaks etched in silver by lingering snow. The land shimmered with promise, fertile bottomland near the water, sheltered by ridges, scattered with meadows bright with late blossoms. For a moment she forgot her weariness and simply gazed, heart swelling with something dangerously close to hope. Beside her he stood silent, his storm-grey eyes narrowing as though measuring every angle, every tree, every shadow. His body, freed now from the shackles, moved differently, straighter, stronger, with the long, confident stride of a man returning to familiar ground. She studied him in the corner of her vision, noting the way he breathed more deeply, the way the lines of tension softened ever so slightly. At the valley's edge they found the skeleton of what might have been a beginning. Rough-hewn logs framed into a dugout, its roof half-finished, door little more than a gap. Eleanor ran her fingers along the weathered wood, the hollow space whispering of abandoned dreams. She recognized it instantly, the broken promise of Samuel Morrison, the man whose letters had brought her here. He had written of a cabin near a stream, of rich soil waiting for a wife's touch. But this was not a home. It was barely shelter. Her throat tightened, yet before despair could swallow her, a gentle pressure touched her shoulder. She turned to see him pointing, not with derision, but with quiet insistence, toward the shelter, then toward the forest and stone, then to his own hands. The meaning was clear. We can build." She blinked at him, startled by the certainty in his eyes. "With what?" she whispered. "I have little money, no tools, no supplies." He only lifted his scarred hands again, flexing them as if to remind her of the strength within them. Then he crouched, smoothing a patch of dirt, drawing with a stick the outline of a cabin. Walls, a roof, smoke curling from a chimney. He added a garden, a fence, and finally 2 small figures standing side by side. And when he looked up at her, the faintest question glimmered in his expression. A home. The breath caught in her throat. After all she had lost, after James's death, after betrayal, after cages and cruelty, here was a man with no voice, offering her the dream of belonging in the language of drawings and gestures. "Yes," she said softly, almost afraid to break the spell. "Yes, let's try." For the first time since she had met him, something shifted in his face. The barest flicker of a smile ghosted across his lips, fleeting but real. He rose then, moving with new purpose, examining the logs, testing the earth, pacing out dimensions. She watched him, a quiet warmth blooming in her chest. They were still strangers bound by law, by a desperate vow in front of a hostile crowd, yet here in the valley's hush the bond began to change. Not just necessity, not just survival, something gentler, something that whispered of healing. They worked until sunset, gathering what they could. Eleanor dragged fallen branches while he split wood with strength that defied his thin frame. When her hands blistered, he paused long enough to take her bag, reinforcing its handle with leather strips so it would not tear beneath the weight. She mended the torn sleeve of his shirt with careful stitches, her fingers brushing the scars along his ribs. They did not speak, but in the rhythm of work, in the quiet nods and exchanged glances, a conversation grew, a language of small kindnesses that stitched them together more surely than words. That night they made camp within the half-built walls. The fire's glow painted the gaps between logs in flickering gold, and Eleanor lay listening to the murmur of the creek, the rustle of leaves overhead. He sat nearby, carving with a shard of wood, his hands moving with forgotten skill. When he finished, he handed it to her. A crude figure of a bird, wings outstretched. She held it, throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered. He only inclined his head, eyes softening in the firelight. She placed the bird on the ledge beside her bedroll, a talisman of fragile hope. Then, as she drew the blanket over herself, she dared to whisper into the night, "We'll make this place a home." He shifted slightly, the chains gone, but his silence still present. Yet she saw him nod, the gesture solemn as an oath. Morning came with the scent of pine and the bright song of water tumbling over stones. Eleanor rose to find him already at work, stripping bark from branches, smoothing wood with practiced motions. His shoulders moved with confidence, his hands deft despite scars. She joined him, carrying stones from the creek for the hearth he had begun to shape. Together they built not only walls but trust, each task a quiet declaration that they were no longer merely surviving, they were beginning again, days blended into one another. The shelter grew. The fireplace took form, stones fitted so tightly not a breath of smoke escaped. They raised beams overhead, layering pine boughs for a roof until the cabin held the sweet scent of resin. Eleanor planted seeds in a patch of soil near the stream, her fingers pressing life into the earth, while he constructed a fence from fallen logs, each post driven deep with the strength of persistence. Evenings brought a gentle ritual. She would prepare what food they had: bread softened in broth, wild berries gathered from the hills, cactus fruit peeled carefully of its spines. He would add to their meal with what he hunted or found: roots, herbs, the occasional rabbit roasted over flame. They shared the quiet, her voice weaving stories of her childhood, his silence filled with watchfulness and the rare soft smile when she made a jest. One night, when the stars burned bright and the air shimmered with the warmth of the fire, he surprised her. From his pocket he drew a small carved horse, worn smooth by years of touch. He placed it gently in her hand, his eyes shadowed yet steady. She traced its lines, feeling the sorrow it carried, the weight of children's laughter now gone. Her heart ached, but she closed her fingers over it and pressed it to her chest. "I'll keep it safe," she promised. Something in him eased then, a breath released after years of silence. He touched her hand briefly, the warmth of his palm lingering even after he withdrew. It was not yet love, not yet trust complete, but it was healing, the fragile bridge between two wounded souls daring to believe in tomorrow. By the time autumn's first chill touched the valley, the cabin stood proud, smoke rising from its chimney. Within its walls lay a bed of pine boughs, softened with quilts Eleanor had bartered from Cedar Falls, a hearth that glowed with steady fire, and shelves lined with simple tools and the wooden bird that watched over them. The valley no longer echoed with emptiness. It carried the quiet hum of belonging. Eleanor stood in the doorway one evening, gazing at the sunset that painted the peaks in rose and violet. He joined her, silent as ever, his presence steady at her side. Without speaking, she slipped her hand into his. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers closed gently around hers, anchoring her as surely as the mountains held the sky. They stood that way until the stars appeared, two figures outlined against the vast wilderness, hearts bruised yet beating, beginning the slow, patient work of turning strangers into something more. The future was uncertain. Shadows of the past still lingered, and dangers waited beyond the valley. But in that moment, Eleanor knew only this: they had begun. And beginnings, no matter how fragile, carry within them the seed of love strong enough to grow even in the rockiest soil. The firelight beckoned them back inside, where warmth and quiet waited. Tomorrow would bring labor, and the next day more, yet each stone, each beam, each stitch brought them closer to a life built not from fear, but from choice. And as Eleanor rested her head upon her arm that night, she felt healing settle over her like the softest of blankets, whispered into her dreams by the steady rhythm of his breath beside her. The wilderness no longer seemed so wide, nor the night so cold, for in the shelter they had built, fragile yet strong, there was the promise of a home, and perhaps with time the promise of love. The first frost came silently, lacing the grass with silver, a reminder that winter would not wait. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter as she stepped outside, breath misting in the crisp dawn air. Their cabin stood behind her, smoke curling from the chimney, proof of their labor and shared will. The valley had begun to feel like sanctuary, but beneath its beauty lingered shadows of the world beyond, the memory of Fowridge's cruelty, the weight of whispers that might follow them still. She sensed those shadows pressing closer with each shortening day. Jacob was already awake, splitting wood near the shed they had raised together. His movements were sure, each swing of the axe steady as a heartbeat. She watched him, marveling at the quiet strength that had once been caged, at the way he carried himself now with a dignity returning piece by piece. When he noticed her, he paused, wiping his brow, and offered her the smallest of smiles. It was fleeting, but it warmed her like sunlight breaking through frost. They shared breakfast by the hearth, bread baked from the last of their flour, apples she had gathered and dried, water sweet from the stream. Jacob listened as Eleanor spoke of her plans for the day, mending curtains, preparing herbs for the cold season, checking the garden that clung stubbornly to life despite the chill. He nodded, his silence no longer emptiness but attentive presence, and then he took up his tools to repair the roof before snow came. By midday, a rider's distant echo broke the valley's peace. Eleanor stiffened, setting down the herbs she was sorting. Jacob emerged from the roof, jaw tightening as the sound grew louder. Soon, 3 figures appeared at the ridge, horses lathered with sweat. She recognized the man leading them, Marcus Garrett, brother of the one Jacob had killed in self-defense. The world seemed to narrow. Garrett's eyes burned with anger, though behind it flickered grief. His companions flanked him, guns glinting in the pale light. Jacob stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between Eleanor and the approaching riders, his body taut with readiness. She laid a hand on his arm, feeling the iron steadiness beneath his skin, but also the tremor of restraint. Garrett reined in his horse at the clearing's edge. "So it's true," he spat. "The beast found himself a wife. Folks in town said you built a home here, living like you're just another man." His voice cracked, grief sharpening into rage. "My brother's blood still cries out. Do you think walls and smoke erase that?" Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice steady, though her heart pounded. "Your brother went to Jacob's camp, armed, seeking trouble. He drew first. Jacob defended himself. No more, no less." Garrett's hand twitched near his holster. Convenient tale for a man who won't even speak. Jacob shifted, his silence heavy, his storm-grey eyes locked on Garrett's. Slowly, he reached into his shirt and pulled forth the small carved horse he always carried. He held it up, then pointed to himself, then mimed cradling a child. His message was simple, undeniable. "I know grief too. I lost family as you did." The gesture pierced the tension like light through cloud. For a moment, Garrett faltered, the fire in his eyes dimming. Eleanor stepped closer, seizing the fragile pause. "Killing him will not bring your brother back. It will only add more sorrow to sorrow. Let this end here, before the valley drinks more blood." Silence stretched, the kind that could break into violence with the smallest spark. One of Garrett's companions shifted uneasily. "Marcus," he muttered, "maybe she's right. Tom always was quick to anger." Garrett's jaw worked, torn between vengeance and the truth laid bare before him. Finally, with a growl that seemed pulled from his very soul, he jerked his reins. "You're lucky today, beast," he hissed. "But know this, you step foot near my kin again, and mercy won't find you twice." He wheeled his horse, his men following, their figures shrinking against the horizon until only dust lingered. Eleanor sagged with relief, her knees weak. But Jacob remained rigid, gaze fixed long after they vanished. She touched his arm again, softly. You showed him who you are, not with words, but with truth. That matters. He turned to her then, storm-grey eyes glistening, and though he said nothing, the way his hand brushed hers was enough. Gratitude, resolve, an unspoken vow. The encounter left its weight upon them, yet also a strange lightness. They had faced vengeance and survived, not by violence, but by the quiet courage of honesty. In that survival lay a new thread of trust, binding them closer. Days later, when they ventured to Cedar Falls for supplies, whispers followed them still. Yet Eleanor noticed a change. Fear tempered with curiosity, hostility softened by respect. The story of the wooden bird he had given a child, the tale of his silent grief, had begun to spread. Some nodded in greeting, others offered cautious smiles. The wilderness was teaching them not only how to endure, but how to heal in the eyes of others. One evening, as snow began to fall in gentle flakes, Jacob placed something new in her hands. A cradle he had been secretly carving in the shed. Its wood gleamed smooth, roses etched delicately along its sides. Eleanor traced the curves, tears rising. It was not only a cradle, it was a promise, a declaration that even broken hearts could build beauty again. She pressed her hand to his, her voice trembling with warmth. This is hope, Jacob. Whatever the future holds, this is hope. For the first time, his lips parted, and though his voice was rough, halting from long disuse, the word emerged clear. Home. Eleanor's tears fell freely, but they were not of sorrow. She leaned close, resting her forehead against his, and whispered, Yes, home. Outside, the snow deepened, cloaking the valley in white. Inside, the fire glowed, the cradle waiting, their hands entwined. And in that quiet moment, the world felt not like a cage, but like a place where healing could take root, where love, fragile, steady, real, could grow stronger with each passing day. The storm beyond their walls would come again. The past would not vanish. But within the cabin, within the circle of warmth and trust they had built, they had already won their first true victory. They had chosen each other against all odds, and in that choice lay the seed of every tomorrow. Winter unfurled itself slowly over the valley, at first a breath of frost on the grass, then a curtain of snow drifting from the grey sky until the world lay hushed beneath white silence. Eleanor woke each morning to find the cabin rimmed in crystal, the creek slowed to glass, the mountains crowned in silver. And the cabin they had raised together stood firm against the cold, its chimney releasing a steady plume of smoke, a beacon of warmth in the wilderness. Inside, the hearth glowed constantly, its flames tended by Jacob with the precision of a man who understood how fragile survival could be. Eleanor busied herself with small labors that made their home more than shelter. She stitched curtains from rough cloth, embroidered with simple patterns of leaves and stars. She lined shelves with dried herbs, their scents of lavender and sage softening the air. She kneaded dough from flour bartered in Cedar Falls, filling the room with the comforting fragrance of bread. Each task, though humble, stitched her heart tighter into this place, this life, this strange marriage born of desperation, but ripening into something richer. Jacob worked with quiet determination. He built a shed beside the cabin where his tools lay neatly arranged, shaping wood and iron into objects that spoke of his craft. Hinges for the door, hooks for their supplies, a chair sturdy enough to cradle her as she worked by firelight. His silence no longer felt like absence. It was a steady river beneath everything, a rhythm that balanced her words when she spoke of memories, of dreams, of fears she rarely voiced aloud. And sometimes, in rare moments when the fire burned low, he would answer, not with many words, but with enough, rough, halting, yet true. One evening, as snow thickened outside, Eleanor found him bent over a piece of oak, carving with fierce concentration. She set her hand on his arm, and he startled slightly, then relaxed beneath her touch. "What is it you're making?" she asked softly, though she did not expect an answer. He turned the wood in his hands, revealing the curve of a small spindle, delicate and purposeful. A spinning wheel, she realized, forming slowly beneath his skilled fingers. He nodded once, and she understood the gift it was meant to be, a tool to weave threads, to create from raw fibers something warm and lasting, healing in wood and motion. She pressed her cheek briefly to his shoulder, gratitude filling her chest. He did not speak, but the way his hand brushed hers as she drew back was answer enough. The storm outside grew fierce. For 3 days the wind howled around their cabin, rattling shutters, burying the world in snow. Within, they lived by the glow of firelight, their breath mingling in the stillness, their shadows stretching together along the walls. Eleanor found comfort in the nearness of him, the way he moved carefully to avoid startling her, the way he placed more wood on the fire before she grew cold, the way he left space between them at night, but never so much that she felt alone. On the 4th night, when the storm finally broke, she woke to a soft sound. Jacob sat near the hearth, the cradle he had built cradled in his hands, though it was far too heavy to hold so. He ran his fingers along its smooth edges, his face caught in the dance of firelight, eyes shadowed by memory. Eleanor rose quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and joined him. She touched the cradle, then his hand. He flinched, but did not pull away. "They would have loved this," she whispered, remembering the fragments he had shared of children gone, of laughter silenced by cruelty. His breath caught. Slowly, he set the cradle down and pressed his forehead into his palms. She slipped her arms around him, tentative at first, then firmer when he did not resist. He trembled against her, not with cold, but with the weight of grief finally loosed. Eleanor held him, her own tears falling, whispering words of comfort, of healing, of remembrance, of the truth that love once given never truly vanished. When at last he lifted his head, his storm-grey eyes shone with something raw, stripped bare. He touched her cheek, hesitant as though afraid she might break beneath his fingers. She leaned into the touch, offering trust in the language of closeness. No vows spoken, no declarations, only the quiet surrender of two souls who had learned too much of loss, daring now to taste the possibility of tenderness. From that night, something shifted. They still worked tirelessly, hauling water, cutting wood, mending clothes. But between tasks grew moments of warmth, small but profound. He would place a carved trinket by her work table, a bird, a star, a flower. She would hum softly as she cooked, and though his silence remained, she sometimes caught him watching her with a softness that needed no words. As winter deepened, neighbors found them. The Winters family came one evening, their wagon nearly trapped by snow, the young wife heavy with child. Eleanor and Jacob opened their door without hesitation, and within hours their small cabin became a place of refuge. Together with the elderly doctor, they guided Sarah Winters through labor while snow piled against the walls. Jacob, hands steady, supported her shoulders as Eleanor wiped her brow. When the baby came, a cry filled the cabin, piercing the night like dawn after endless darkness. Sarah named her daughter Hope. The name seemed to settle into the very beams of the cabin, a blessing spoken aloud. Jacob held the newborn briefly, cradling her as though the weight of memory might shatter him. Yet his hands were gentle, his eyes luminous with something Eleanor had never seen before. Sorrow and wonder intermingled, pain and healing braided together. When he passed the child back, his voice, hoarse and broken, whispered one word: perfect. Eleanor caught her breath. Each word he spoke was a treasure, wrested from silence at great cost, and she gathered them carefully in her heart. That night, when the Winters family slept soundly in their bed, she found Jacob awake, the baby's cradle beside him, his gaze lost in firelight. She joined him quietly, laying her hand over his. He turned to her, and for the first time he did not simply touch or nod. He spoke, halting but true. "Thank you for seeing me." Her chest ached with warmth. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "Always." The days that followed were gentler. Snow still fell, hunger still threatened, but the cabin no longer felt like exile. It was becoming a haven, not only for them, but for those who crossed their path. The Winters family left with blessings and gratitude, promising friendship in the seasons ahead. Eleanor and Jacob returned to their rhythm, yet something within them had changed. Their silences grew comfortable, their glances longer, their touches less hesitant. One evening, as twilight bathed the snow in rose, Jacob brought her to the shed. There stood the spinning wheel, finished at last, polished until it gleamed. Eleanor laid her hand upon it, tears brimming. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He watched her closely, his storm-grey eyes searching. She turned to him, smiling through her tears. "You give me more than I ever dreamed. You give me life again." His throat worked, and then he answered softly, the words rough but steady. "You give me reason." The wheel turned beneath her fingers, smooth and true, and Eleanor knew then that they were no longer strangers bound by desperation. They were partners bound by choice, by quiet healing, by love that grew like fire in the cold, steady and enduring. Outside, the snow fell. Inside, warmth glowed. And though winter still pressed hard against the valley, within the cabin there was peace, and the tender unfolding of a love strong enough to carry them into the spring that waited just beyond the horizon. Spring seeped into the valley like a long-awaited blessing, slow at first, with timid rivulets of snowmelt trickling through the meadow, then suddenly bold as wildflowers flared open across the slopes in bright patches of gold and violet. Eleanor stepped out one morning and breathed in air that no longer bit her lungs, but caressed them, tinged with the sweetness of budding pines and damp earth. The cabin they had built stood strong after winter's trials, its roof holding steady, its hearth seasoned by storms survived. Around it, life unfurled, a garden sprouting green shoots, a corral waiting for animals they might one day keep, and in the doorway, Jacob, his storm-grey eyes softened by the season's gentle light. He had changed with the turning of months. Freed from chains, his shoulders had broadened again, strength returning to his limbs with each task. Yet it was not only his body that mended. Something inside him, long buried beneath grief and silence, was stirring. Eleanor saw it in the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way he touched objects he built. Chairs, shelves, a carved bead necklace for her, with reverence, as if each creation stitched him back into the fabric of living. She wore those beads often, their delicate etchings of wild flowers, a reminder that beauty could be shaped even from sorrow. The valley was no longer only theirs. Word had spread, carried by travellers and whispers, of the woman who had married the caged man and built a home with him in the wilderness. At first, curiosity drew cautious visitors, neighbours from scattered homesteads, hunters passing through, families seeking help when tools broke or illness struck. Some came wary, expecting to find the beast of rumour, and instead they found a man whose silence held dignity, whose hands worked with patient skill, and a woman whose kindness met suspicion with calm steadiness. One afternoon, Tom Winters rode up with his wife Sarah and baby Hope bundled in Sarah's arms. Eleanor rushed to greet them, her heart swelling at the sight of the child whose first cry had filled their cabin with new life months ago. Jacob stepped from the shed, wiping his hands on a cloth, and Sarah offered him a smile that carried no fear, only gratitude. "She still sleeps best when held the way you showed me," Sarah said softly. Jacob inclined his head, a ghost of a smile brushing his lips. He reached a calloused hand toward the baby, and little Hope, unafraid, gripped his finger with her tiny fist. Something in his face eased then, a line of old pain softening beneath the weight of new trust. As weeks passed, their homestead became part of the valley's pulse. Jacob began to travel to Cedar Falls twice a week, working at the general store, repairing wagons, forging hinges and tools. Eleanor watched with quiet pride as he returned each time with silver coins earned honestly, sometimes with goods traded for his craftsmanship. The townspeople, once wary, began to nod respectfully, addressing him as Mr. Stone. Eleanor knew how much weight that name carried, the choice he had made to let Jacob be born from Josiah's ashes. It was not denial of the past, but a way forward, and she honoured it. One evening, as twilight gilded the peaks, Eleanor waited on the porch, watching the trail. Jacob appeared at last, leading their mule laden with supplies. She ran to meet him, taking the smaller bundles from his hands. "You've been late," she teased gently, though relief laced her voice. He touched her cheek, rough thumb brushing her skin, and murmured, halting but clear, "Work longer today. People trust me more." His words, though simple, rang with quiet triumph. Eleanor pressed her forehead to his, whispering, "You've earned it. Every glance, every kindness, it's changing them." The community's acceptance grew slowly but surely. When a wagon overturned on the muddy street of Cedar Falls, Jacob was among the first to rush forward, his gestures coordinating men until the driver was freed. When an old man's cane broke, Jacob repaired it with such care that the town whispered less of beast and more of craftsman. Eleanor noticed, too, how children began to gather near him, fascinated by the small wooden animals he carved in spare moments. He would offer them freely, his hands awkward yet tender as he passed a bird or horse to eager fingers. The laughter of children near him became a balm, each giggle loosening the chain of grief that still lingered in his chest. Eleanor herself found friendship blossoming. Sarah visited often, baby Hope in tow, their afternoons filled with shared stories and laughter. Other women, curious at first, came to ask about her garden or to trade preserves. At night, when she and Jacob sat by the fire, she told him how the valley was beginning to see them not as outcasts, but as part of its living story. He listened, silent but attentive, his eyes glimmering with something like wonder. And between them, love grew, not sudden, not burning, but steady as spring's thaw. It lived in the way Jacob's hand lingered on hers when passing a bowl, in the way he tucked blankets around her at night, in the way he bent close to catch every word of her soft songs. It bloomed in the way Eleanor leaned against him as they watched the sun set, the warmth of his presence more certain than the fire at their hearth. One night, as stars spilled like silver across the sky, Eleanor laid her hand over his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart. "Do you ever regret it?" she whispered. He turned to her, eyes searching hers, and shook his head. His voice was rough, fragile, but the word was clear. "Never." She closed her eyes, tears slipping free, and breathed against his shoulder. "Nor do I." Spring ripened into summer. Their fields grew green, their cabin filled with the scents of bread and pine, and their days became a rhythm of labor and rest, of shared silence and gentle laughter. Yet Eleanor knew shadows would come again. The past was not gone, only quiet. But she also knew they were stronger now, their roots entwined like trees weathering storms together. As she stood one morning at the threshold of their home, watching Jacob bend over the forge he had built by the shed, sparks flying into the clear air, she felt it deep in her bones. The wilderness had given them not just survival, but renewal. In his silence, she had found truth. In her steadfastness, he had found belonging. And together they had begun to carve something rare and enduring, a life woven from grief and healing, bound by love steady enough to face whatever lay ahead. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers across the valley. Eleanor breathed it in, her heart full, her hand resting over the necklace of carved beads he had given her. Behind her, the cradle still waited, empty, but no longer a symbol of loss. It was a promise, patient and hopeful, of whatever blessings time might bring. She turned toward Jacob, and he looked up, his storm-grey eyes meeting hers with a depth that spoke what words still struggled to carry. She smiled, and in that smile lay everything they had endured, everything they were becoming, and everything that waited just beyond the horizon. The summer sun had begun to wane, its golden light stretching longer shadows across the valley, when the first sign of trouble arrived. A letter came by way of a trader, its seal pressed in unfamiliar wax, its words sharp as a blade. Eleanor read it with trembling hands by the light of the hearth, her voice faltering as she spoke it aloud to Jacob. The men who had murdered her first husband in Ohio had been arrested for another crime. The prosecutor now called upon her to testify, to bring her voice against them at last. The cabin fell into silence after her words. Jacob stood by the window, his broad frame outlined by fading daylight, eyes storm-grey and unreadable. He did not speak, but Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze on her, steady and anchoring. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest as if to still the storm in her heart. She had thought her past laid to rest here among the mountains, buried beneath garden soil and woven into the beams of their home. Yet it had found her again, demanding truth. That night, Eleanor lay awake, listening to Jacob's breathing beside her. The thought of leaving him, of crossing miles of wilderness and towns where whispers might follow her name, made her chest ache. Yet the voice of James, her first husband, seemed to echo faintly, reminding her of promises unfulfilled. Justice had been denied once. Could she live with herself if she turned away now? Jacob stirred, as though sensing her unrest. In the dim glow of embers, he reached for her hand, calloused fingers closing around hers. His voice, rough but sure, broke the silence. "Go." Tears pricked her eyes. "And leave you here alone?" she whispered. His thumb brushed her skin, a silent reassurance. "Home waits." The word caught, as though carrying more meaning than speech could bear. She pressed her forehead to his chest, listening to the slow beat of his heart, drawing strength from it. At last she nodded, her decision sealed not by duty alone, but by the trust that he would be waiting. 3 days later, she stood at the coach station in Cedar Falls, her carpet bag packed, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Jacob was beside her, mule tied to the post, his face carved in calm, though his hand trembled when it closed around hers. The townspeople watched discreetly, some curious, some quietly respectful. When the coach rattled into view, Eleanor's courage wavered, but Jacob drew her close, his lips brushing her hair as he whispered, "Come back." "Always," she answered. And then she was gone, carried eastward into the unknown. The journey was long, each mile pulling her farther from the valley, from the hearth's glow, from the steady presence of Jacob. Yet she carried him with her, in the necklace of carved beads at her throat, in the memory of his hand in hers, in the whispered vow of home. In Ohio, the trial unfolded like reopening a wound. She faced men whose cruelty had stolen her first life, endured their lawyers' scorn, relived the moment James had fallen in the fields they once called theirs. Her voice shook, but did not break. She spoke with the strength of a woman who had seen injustice before and refused to bow to it again. The verdict came guilty, yet there was no triumph in her heart, only a closing, like the shutting of a door long left ajar. Justice was served, but healing had already begun in the valley with Jacob. Letters bridged the distance between them. Jacob wrote sparingly, each word heavy with care. Roof strong, garden growing, winter's family visit often, miss your bread, miss you. Another read, made you a spinning wheel, waiting, always waiting. His voice, though halting on paper, carried across miles to steady her. She wrote back with pages full of warmth, painting their home in words, reminding him that her heart lived there with him. When at last she returned, weary from the journey but lightened by its end, the coach pulled into Cedar Falls at dusk. She stepped down, clutching her bag, and there he was, waiting by the mule, storm-grey eyes searching the crowd until they found hers. He strode forward, caught her in his arms, and for the first time before witnesses kissed her fully. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, but Eleanor only laughed through tears. They rode home together beneath a sky gilded with the last light. The valley opened before them, their cabin standing proud, flowers blooming in boxes beneath its windows. Eleanor gasped at the sight. Jacob had worked tirelessly in her absence, building not only walls, but beauty. A porch wrapped around the cabin now, rocking chairs placed side by side. It was as if he had shaped his longing into wood and nails, every board a testament to his waiting. Inside, he led her to the hearth. From his pocket he drew out a ring he had forged himself, its metals intertwined: iron, silver, copper, strength, beauty, warmth. His hands trembled as he slipped it onto her finger. "Strong," he said simply, voice breaking. "Like us." Her tears fell freely. She produced a plain gold band she had bought in Ohio, slipping it onto his finger with steady hands. "This time it is not duty, it is love." He cupped her face, and their lips met again, not hurried, not desperate, but sure. An embrace carved from survival, from healing, from the choice to love despite all that had been lost. That night, as they lay together beneath the quilt she had sewn, Eleanor whispered into the quiet, "Do you ever regret it? That day in the square when I stood before your cage?" Jacob was silent so long she thought he had drifted into sleep. Then, rough and certain, he answered, "Only regret." "No words, then. You saved me, Eleanor, from chains, from myself, from becoming what they feared." "Love," his voice faltered, then steadied. "Love saved me." Her tears wet the pillow, but they were tears of joy. She nestled closer, heart full. "We saved each other." Beyond their window, the wilderness lay vast, still filled with dangers, still echoing with ghosts. But within the cabin, warmth glowed, steady and bright. They had faced grief, faced vengeance, faced distance, and still they stood, stronger for it. The cradle Jacob had built remained in the corner, empty but waiting, not a reminder of loss, but of promise, that life yet held blessings untold. The night stretched on, stars wheeling silently above, and in their small cabin, two broken hearts, now bound, breathed in rhythm. Love, slow and steady, had taken root deep in the rocky soil of sorrow, and from it blossomed something enduring. Tomorrow would bring labor, perhaps more trials, but also laughter, bread rising in the oven, the hammer's song at the forge, the quiet moments where words were few, but presence said everything. And as dawn began to paint the horizon gold, Eleanor stirred, her hand resting over Jacob's heart. He opened his eyes, storm-grey, yet softened now by peace, and whispered the word that had become their vow. "Home." She smiled, answering with the truth that carried them both. Always home. The seasons circled once more, each turn of the earth layering the valley with new memories. By the time another spring had passed into summer, the homestead that Eleanor and Jacob had built together no longer looked like a fragile shelter carved out of wilderness. It was a true home, sturdy and warm, with fields tilled and a workshop humming with life. The porch where she liked to sit in the evenings now bore the marks of countless hours together, her sewing basket resting on one chair, Jacob's carved pieces scattered like tokens of quiet devotion on the railings. Neighbours came more often now, no longer out of suspicion or curiosity, but out of friendship. Families brought baskets of apples or jars of preserves to trade for Jacob's ironwork. Children ran up the path without fear, hoping for another carved bird or tiny horse. Men greeted Jacob with nods of respect, their voices free of mockery, and women sought Eleanor's advice for gardens or medicine. What once was a story of scandal whispered in saloons had become a tale retold with softened voices. The widow who offered her hand to a caged man, and the man who proved himself more human, more kind than those who had judged him. On warm evenings the Winters family often visited. Little Hope, now toddling, would rush into Jacob's arms without hesitation. He would lift her high, the shadow of grief in his eyes easing with each giggle she gifted him. Eleanor would watch, her heart swelling at the sight of him cradling life again, not haunted now, but healing. She and Sarah shared laughter by the hearth, while their husbands spoke in quiet tones of building projects, fences to mend, land to share. It was community at its most fragile and most beautiful, woven out of trust that had once seemed impossible. The cabin itself carried their story in its walls. The spinning wheel Jacob had made for her stood near the window, sunlight glinting off its polished wood. The cradle still rested in the corner, waiting patiently, not empty in sorrow, but brimming with promise. Sometimes Eleanor would run her fingers along its edge, imagining futures not yet written, and Jacob would place a hand over hers, no words spoken but comfort, flowing steady as breath. Love had come slowly to them, but when it bloomed, it was steady as the mountains around their valley. They did not need grand declarations. Their days together spoke louder. The bread she baked with care, the beams he lifted into place, the way they leaned into each other's silences. Each was a vow renewed. On nights when the sky turned wild with stars, Eleanor would rest her head against Jacob's chest and listen to the rhythm of his heart. He would stroke her hair with gentle fingers, sometimes whispering halting words, "Thank you for staying, for seeing me, for giving me back myself." She would answer not with speeches, but with a kiss, a touch, a presence that promised he would never face the dark alone again. One morning, as summer turned toward autumn, the valley woke to the sound of a bell. Jacob had forged it at the request of the town, its voice clear and ringing across the ridges. He and Eleanor stood together as it hung in Cedar Falls' new chapel. The townspeople gathered, listening. The sound carried not only metal strength, but also something more, the echo of redemption. When the last note faded, the preacher clasped Jacob's shoulder, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Your hands have given us more than a bell," he said. "You've given us hope." Eleanor squeezed Jacob's hand, and he returned the pressure, storm-grey eyes lifting to hers. She saw it there. The man who had once been shackled in silence, now accepted, even honoured. The town that had once feared him now called him by name. It was not triumph that filled her chest, but peace, the kind that heals slowly, like dawn washing night away. Back in their valley, life settled into rhythms that felt eternal. The forge sang, the fields ripened, the fire glowed each evening. They built not only with wood and stone, but with trust, laughter, and the quiet bravery of two people choosing love after loss. And though the scars of their pasts never vanished, they no longer defined them. Instead, those scars became part of the beauty, like gold lines mending broken pottery, making it stronger, more precious than before. On a clear night, as cicadas hummed and the stars shimmered overhead, Eleanor stood at the porch rail. Jacob came behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist, his breath warm against her hair. "Home," he whispered, the word still rough, but now full of life. She leaned into him, tears of quiet joy filling her eyes. "Yes," she answered, her voice soft as prayer. "Home and love and healing. Always." The valley stretched wide before them, endless yet intimate, carrying their laughter, their work, their story into the future. Whatever tomorrow held, storms, trials, joys, they would face it together. For together was the vow, the healing, the gift. And in that truth lay a love that would not break. If this story has touched something within you, if it has brought warmth to your heart, or reminded you that even in the harshest wilderness, love and healing can grow, I invite you to share that feeling. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to journey further with us, and let your presence add light to this circle of warmth. Each gesture, small as it may seem, is like a spark to the fire, a way of keeping hope alive and love shared. Thank you for walking with Eleanor and Jacob, for believing in their story, and for carrying a piece of it into your own.